Hi, and welcome to Smartgridlock, the tragedy of the Anticommons and solar on strata apartment buildings. Wollongong University is researching solar on New South Wales strata buildings, and I was asked to answer these questions during the week, and I thought I'd give a quick overview of my answers to these questions. Whether solar PV can be installed according to applicable laws in Australia is not really an issue. The owners corporation has to have the funds to pay for the solution up front because at the current point in time, strata schemes aren't comfortable taking out forms of finance or leasing for solar PV. Now, when it comes to whether the long-term financial benefits exceed the long-term financial costs, I say this is important, but it's not the most important because if we look broadly, the financial literacy of the people in our strata schemes is not always developed to the level that they can take that long-term financial analysis view. Whether there are reliable technicians available which can do the install is much more important to these strata buildings than whether there's a long-term financial benefit. They're looking at the downside risk of a bad install and what that could mean for their building rather than the longer term financial return or gain. And obviously competing priorities is a massive issue that often stops solar. The argument should be that solar shouldn't be an either or. It should be a both and proposition with whatever the other competing priority is. But of all of these points I was asked to look at from Wollongong University researchers into exploring and developing solar power adoption for New South Wales strata property owners, the last one, whether interpersonal politics influences the owners' corporation decisions, is by far and away the most important of all these factors. So this led me to look at a little bit of other academic research. There was a term coined the tragedy of the commons by a British economist called William Foster Lloyd. And it occurs when too many people have the rights to use public property, and this leads to overuse. And you can imagine a great example in Britain was a common green where all the people in the village could use it to put their sheep and allow the sheep to graze. Basically, that destroyed the value of the common green because too many people abused the power. Now, another academic principle was brought to light in 1998, and that's the opposite. That's called the tragedy of the Anticommons. And it was developed by Michael Heller. And this occurs where there are too many owners that have control over a single piece of property, making it impossible to use or maintain effectively. And you end up with the same result as the tragedy of the commons in that the value of the asset is destroyed. And to illustrate this, here's a picture of a strata rooftop in Australia, and you can notice there are no solar panels on this strata rooftop. Australia is one of the best countries for solar power. If we look at the solar penetration on residential house rooftops, it's 22%. Yet, if we look at the residential strata schemes or the apartment blocks, it's at 0.6%. So why is solar on strata rooftops a tragedy of the anti-commons? Well, at first, an anti-commons is initially invisible, and it takes a while for people to actually spot the underused resource. And in an anti-commons, you've got multiple owners who have the right to exclude others from a scarce resource. No one has an effective privilege of using that resource. In 1961, the New South Wales government passed the Conveyancing Strata Titles Act and defined strata rooftops as being common property. It wasn't until 2009 that solar panels really began to take off in Australia. And then between 2009 and 2011, the rate of install of solar PV on residential houses increased tenfold. It then quadrupled again by 2016. Now, if we go and have a look at residential apartment buildings during the same era, we weren't able to find a New South Wales strata property that installed before 2011. Since that time, the penetration of solar on residential apartment buildings increased from 0% to 0.6%. Once an anti-commons emerges, collecting the rights of those individuals into usable private property bundles can be brutal and slow. And that's what we've been witnessing when it comes to solar rollout on strata title rooftops. Now, in February 2021, the New South Wales government amended the Strata Schemes Management Act to reduce the rights of owners to exclude other owners from solar. Very important. So that's government regulation identifying that there's an Anticommons in place and doing something to reduce the rights of owners to exclude each other from utilising the residential apartment building rooftop. We have to have a look at group complexity in a strata scheme because this is the current barrier which we are facing. The problem of resource complexity has been solved at a technical level, whether that's through use of special use bylaws, whether it's through use of an Illume Energy solar sharing gateway, or whether it's through the use of an embedded network. The remaining hurdle for getting solar onto residential strata buildings is group complexity and its offspring, the reactive egoism of individuals. So we need to understand group complexity in strata related to solar. And this is to say it's not possible to overcome an anticommons when it arises, but self-regulation can be difficult. So what are the fragment owners in strata, and how can we understand the group complexity? Well, we've got ownership status. A typical one is an owner-occupier has a different set of drivers from an owner-investor. The age of the owners, an elderly resident might say, we won't get a payback on solar in the years I have remaining. You've got the relative affluence of owner-occupiers within the same building, 3-bedroom versus 2-bedroom versus studio apartment owners. If you think about those individuals, what's the size of their outstanding balance on their individual mortgage? What's their aggregate household income? And overall, what's the strength of the Strata Schemes Capital Works Fund? Now, this next item, financial literacy of owners. And this is not to say that we don't have smart people living in the strata buildings. We just don't have broad-based education around concepts in financial terms like internal rate of return, net present value, effective interest rates, return on capital. These terms that a financial analyst or an accountant would use actually can clearly indicate the benefit of installing solar and taking a longer term view in the building. The other term is opportunity cost or cost of delay. This is not well understood, and there's an opportunity to improve financial literacy amongst owners in residential strata schemes. Another differentiator of the fragment owners is their relative social investment in the building. You might have had someone who's been a long-term strata committee member for 20 years, and you've got a new owner, the new kid on the block who's not on the strata committee, and they have a different social weight within that strata community. The length of time as an owner is important because in New South Wales, the average time that people own an apartment unit is usually about 9 years. If you're working with solar that may pay back within 7 years, the time frame that the people have lived in the building, you know, when they're driven by self-interest, comes into play. And then you've got the relative position of different people within the block physically. So a penthouse owner might be worried about water penetration through the roof after solar is installed above their penthouse, or in a multi-building scheme, you might have one building overlooking another building, and those people might be worried about reflectivity or aesthetics of the solar panels that they're going to look at after they're installed. So what are some strategies to unlock this smart gridlock? Well, assuming that you've got a state or province or federal government that's implemented a strategy to reduce the rights to exclude, and an example of that is the New South Wales government has done this with the Sustainability Infrastructure Amendment to the New South Wales Strata Schemes Management Act, then the next step is to select one of the following 3 strategies. And I should outline, you're not as effective doing strategy number 2 after you've already tried strategy 1. And similarly, you're not as effective doing strategy 3 after you've already tried strategy number 1. So one is you can use a social framework to try and achieve social cohesion and bring people together. maybe for a kumbaya moment around solar. The second is you can reduce the opportunity for reactive egoism of individual owners. And the third is you can outsource and throw the problem over the wall onto a third party. So here's an example of using a social framework to achieve social cohesion. And this has just been adapted from onthecommons.org. So basically, you're building a shared value system. People that are familiar with the McKinsey 7S model around shared values, effectively, you have to do the same thing within the context of your residential strata apartment building community. And this would be the approach which is taken most often by not-for-profits working in the solar on strata sector and local governments working in the solar on strata sector. The second strategy is to reduce the opportunity for reactive egoism of owners. Now, basically in negotiation theory, people are always saying, try to see this decision from the other person's perspective. However, if you actually have a group of owners in an apartment building taking the perspectives of each other, this can sometimes trigger reactive egoism, and it can actually activate a cynical side in each of the owners. Some strategies you can use to reduce reactive egoism are actually reducing dialogue between different owners prior to voting on a solar motion. This reduces the perspective taking between individuals, and the individuals don't actually find out how divergent their views are of each other. Another strategy, give owners an online resource, a solar education kit to work through at a self-paced manner on their own. Another thing is you can book a facilitator to run an online Zoom session. And effectively what happens is the owners can participate and ask questions of the facilitator, but the heat is on the facilitator, not owner versus owners putting heat on each other. And then another effective strategy is to have the members of that owners corporation, the owners, vote on the solar motion at an electronic EGM or AGM. Now, what this does is it avoids in-person voting, and it avoids the situation where people are in the same room and can see other people and how they're voting, and then adapt their voting strategy to how the other people are in order to try and achieve some sort of consensus vote. So it's actually more effective in strata in states where you've got electronic voting approved to actually use electronic voting on a solar motion, and that way you get blind voting and people are voting based on their own motivations, not necessarily because of social pressure that's given to them from other people. The third strategy is to outsource the problem and throw it over the wall onto a third party. So effectively, this fragmented set of ownership rights gets consolidated and just given to another party to deal with. Now, when this happens, the owners are giving up some of their rightful monopoly rents. They will hand this necessarily to the third-party organisation. That could be a third-party organisation which is a for-profit organisation, or a third-party organisation which is a not-for-profit organisation. Effectively, you're centralising the decision-making rights and also, importantly, putting the risk onto a third party. And so these are three different approaches that can be taken. I hope you've enjoyed the tragedy of the Anticommons and solar on residential strata apartment buildings. Thank you.